This week on Brian Ross Investigates, a CIA mystery. Was this former intelligence officer and dozens of other U.S. personnel targeted by a secret Russian high-tech energy wave weapon?
I woke up in the middle of the night in a Moscow hotel, and I woke up with an incredible case of vertigo, tinnitus, which is ringing in the ears, splitting headache.
It's called the Havana Syndrome, after U.S. personnel first reported the symptoms in Cuba. But there's growing evidence it's the latest act of aggression by Russian President Putin.
The victims are not making this up. There's just too many of us. It's happened too many times.
Plus, new details on the grisly murder of a Washington Post journalist, last seen entering the Saudi embassy in Istanbul.
He was drugged, he was suffocated, and his body was carved up with a bone saw. And the pieces of his body were put into plastic bags and then burned, for the most part, in a tandoor oven.
Jamal Khashoggi's killers were put on trial in Saudi Arabia, but investigative reporter Mike Isikoff has new details on what actually happened to them.
They're not behind bars. It's a luxury compound, and one of them was recently seen working out at the gym.
Plus, this week's winners and losers in the media. See if you agree with the choices of the editors of Mediaite.
Fox Corp has been muzzling me to keep certain information from you, the viewers, and from what I'm gathering, I am not the only reporter being subjected to this.
From the Law&Crime Trial Network, this is Brian Ross Investigates. Good evening, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to our friends on Facebook Live. I'm Brian Ross, joined as always by my colleague Rhonda Schwartz. And Rhonda, we begin with a real-life spy mystery, whether the Russians have been targeting American spies and diplomats with a secret weapon that uses high energy waves to affect the brain. It's what's called the Havana Syndrome, Rhonda.
That's right, Brian. And there's now 130 Americans who've reported that they believe they've been victims of these attacks while stationed in Havana, Washington, China, and Russia. And we're about to hear now from one of the American spies who's been a target in what's been described as another example of Russian aggression against the United States.
Invisible attacks on American spies and diplomats. It's a medical mystery that is almost certainly wrapped in the age-old and high-stakes spy games between the U.S. and Russia.
There are growing suspicions that Russian intelligence officers are behind a mysterious illness called Havana Syndrome.
The symptoms were sudden and shocking. Sleeplessness, headaches, inability to walk, memory loss, cognitive difficulties.
Individuals suffering from it have reported a range of neurological symptoms. There are now at least 130 suspected cases across at least 6 countries. Lawmakers are trying to determine if the brain injuries from the affliction could be caused by energy waves from devices used to extract information from cell phones and other electronics. The Senate passed a bill this week offering financial support for victims of this mysterious illness.
In the letter, which was sent to State Department leadership, the diplomats claim the U.S. government has denied employees and their family access to medical evaluations and treatment, rejected evidence of their injuries, and invalidated their experiences.
And we're joined now by Mark Polymeropoulos. And Mark, thank you for being here this evening. First of all, how are you feeling?
Thanks, Brian. It's good to be here. I'm actually feeling a lot better. After going public in October of last year about, my need for healthcare, I did end up going to Walter Reed's National Intrepid Center of Excellence, which is, the world's leading traumatic brain injury program. And it was a month-long program where I saw, 18 different specialists, and I left there probably feeling 20 to 25% better. But more importantly, it gave me 2 things. It gave me tools and it gave me hope.
And what were the initial symptoms you had?
Sure. So, in December of 2017, I woke up in the middle of the night in a Moscow hotel, in a 5-star hotel, just 2 blocks from the U.S. Embassy. And I woke up with an incredible case of vertigo, tinnitus, which is ringing in the ears, splitting headache. I felt like physically sick, but, as I've said, and I thought about it quite a bit, I'd served in war zones such as Iraq and Afghanistan, for years on end. But this incident in Moscow was the most terrifying experience of my life. The vertigo really, made me feel like I lost control. And so that started a healthcare journey that until today is, it's lasted with a headache for 3 years.
You were forced to leave the CIA because of your health issues. And at the time this happened, you were a senior CIA official overseeing operations in Russia. Do you believe you were targeted by the Russians?
Yeah, so the last job I had, prior to retirement, I was the acting operations chief over what we call the Europe and Eurasia Mission Center. So I was responsible for our operations, across Europe, everywhere from Dublin all the way across the continent, but then into Eurasia as well, which included Russia. And so, yes, I do. I believe I was targeted because of my trip there. I was a senior officer. I was in the senior intelligence service. The Russians certainly knew who I was, and at that time, we were embarking on what we called, the great pushback against the Russians after their interference in the U.S. elections in 2016, as well as what they were doing in Europe as well. And so, I think, my contention, it's my belief. I've been out of government for a while, so I can't come to you with actual, intelligence information on this, but I believe I was targeted because of my role, in working against Russia.
And at this point, do you have a better idea of what it was with which you were targeted?
So I think the answer is, I think we do. I think the belief is that it was a directed energy weapon. Last year, the National Academy of Sciences put out a report, based on their analysis of what happened to officers in Cuba and China. And Dr. David Relman, who is a leading Stanford researcher, he wrote the report, and in essence, it concluded that we were all likely hit by a directed energy weapon.
We have neurologists on our committee that said afterwards, in my entire career of reading about countless hundreds and thousands of cases of neurologic injury, I've never heard of something like this.
So I think, that combined with, subsequent attacks on intelligence community personnel, all who were involved in working against Russia, I think in my mind, at least the conclusion that the Russians were up to something. And look, they've had this technology, this weapon, for some time. So, you put two and two together, and that's where, at least I stand right now.
And do you believe it was targeted to harm you, or was there another purpose, perhaps to try to tap into your phone and hack into your internet?
Right, Brian. That's a great question. I think some of the first things I thought of in my mind is that it was exactly that, a kind of a signals intelligence system, collection system that maybe was turned up too much. And that certainly is a possibility. I would never discount anything. But I think that ultimately over time, I think we've moved a bit towards the directed energy weapon. But look, I think what's most important in this discussion now, as we're sitting here in June of 2021, is we're not talking about this being psychosomatic. The victims are not making this up. There's just too many of us. It's happened too many times. And while in the beginning, a lot of us were not believed by our parent organizations, whether it was the State Department or Department of Defense or the CIA, I think we've moved past that now. Something really bad has happened.
But your symptoms were so serious, you had to leave the CIA well before you wanted to. Is that right?
Look, I retired at 50 because I could have, but I was 50. So I had a lot more left in the tank. I didn't want to retire. And, 50 years old, I think, in this day and age, you got a long way to go after that. And so, but the fact of the matter is I couldn't go to work for a full day, just like now. Like I have about 2 or 3 hours a day where I can really concentrate until the headaches, which I've had every day for 3 years, until the headaches get too severe and I have to rest. But no doubt I couldn't work a full day anymore. So I had to retire.
You've since written about the lessons to be learned from your service in the CIA, clarity in crisis. What did you do about this crisis, and what are the lessons you've learned being such a senior official at the CIA?
So the book is called Clarity in Crisis, Leadership Lessons from the CIA. And there's 9 principles I came up with that I learned over failure over the years. This is not something that I walked in with or was taught. It's something that I developed over time. But ultimately, the gray is your happy place. And so, when others want to flee, or when people have fear of ambiguity, fear of uncertainty, that's a time where a CIA officer, at least myself, and many of my other colleagues, that's where we felt most comfortable. So I wrote a book. I think it's going to really resonate with the American public. It's not for a Harvard MBA class, but it's based on my time in the third world. And it can be certainly used, by the American public. And what better time to talk about it in the time of COVID, when there was an incredible time of uncertainty and ambiguity in the United States and the world.
And how is the CIA doing today, do you think, under a new administration, new leadership?
So I was fairly critical of the past administration in my fight with them to obtain health care. But I'll tell you that the new CIA director, Bill Burns, in my view, has been quite extraordinary. On my issue in particular, on the issue of caring for those who were affected by the direct energy attacks. But also, I think he's the right person for the job now. He's a career national security professional. He was a consumer of intelligence, so he knows what intelligence can do. He believes deeply in in things like human intelligence, which was my forte. If you watched his confirmation hearing, I think all of us were kind of popping champagne corks. There was someone that said in the media that Langley was celebrating that day because I think we got a really good director. From my contacts inside, he's enormously popular, and I think he's the right person at the right time.
All right, Mark Polymeropoulos, the author of the new book, Clarity in Crisis. Thank you for being here, and thank you for your service to this country.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here.
Coming up, new details in the grisly murder of a Washington Post journalist, last seen walking into the Saudi embassy in Istanbul, and what happened to the men who were convicted of killing him. You're watching Brian Ross Investigates on the Law and Crime Trial Network. Tonight, there are new details in the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi, last seen walking into the Saudi embassy in Istanbul. And until now, nothing has been known about what happened to the men who were actually convicted of killing him, all with close ties to the Saudi crown prince. To get the latest on this, we're joined by Mike Isikoff, the chief investigative correspondent for Yahoo News, whose latest edition of Conspiracyland, the podcast, deals with the grisly murder of Mr. Khashoggi. Mike, thanks for being here tonight. What have you learned that we did not know before?
First of all, I have to say, this was one of, if not the most grisly, gruesome murder of modern times. A journalist, a world famous, prominent journalist who was savagely murdered inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. He was drugged, he was suffocated, and his body was carved up with a bone saw. And the pieces of his body were put into plastic bags and then burned, for the most part, in a tandoor oven at the home of the Saudi consul general in Istanbul. So, it is so chilling just to go over what happened here. But one thing we discovered is there is more to the story, more to how this happened. And one of the things we discovered is we knew that a Gulfstream jet carrying a team of Saudi assassins, a Tiger team, left for Riyadh on the evening of October 1st, 2018, landed in Istanbul at 3:30 in the morning on October 2nd. What was not known is that jet made a pit stop. It stopped in the middle of the night in Cairo, Egypt, where, according to the notes that I discovered in the record in a court record in Istanbul, these are notes taken by Turkish embassy observers at a closed-door Saudi trial that took place in Saudi Arabia, is those assassins were delivered a lethal dose of narcotics that were injected into Khashoggi's left arm hours later on October 2nd by a Saudi Ministry of Interior doctor, killing him within a matter of minutes. He was effectively poisoned. These lethal drugs were what killed Jamal Khashoggi.
So, Mike, was this a kill mission from the get-go? It was always the plan to kill him, not to kidnap him, bring him back to Saudi Arabia?
That has always been the central question. What this new information points to, and there's lots of other evidence to back this up as well, is that it became a kill operation before that plane landed in Istanbul, before Khashoggi ever walked into the consulate. And plus, one of the other new details we have in this podcast is that there was a on-the-ground leader of the team, a guy by the name of Mahir Mutreb, a Saudi intelligence officer, somebody who used to work with Khashoggi in the Saudi embassy in London. Mutreb was selected for that job precisely because he had a relationship with Khashoggi. The purpose was to lull him into complacency.
Now, of course, the Saudi crown prince reacted supposedly with horror, put people on trial. What sort of a trial was that? Because you now have obtained documents that sort of account for what happened there we haven't seen before.
Exactly. This was a closed door trial, no press allowed, no human rights monitors allowed, no public record exists. But what I discovered in the court records in Istanbul is that Turkish embassy observers were allowed to sit in on the trial, and they took notes from what the prosecutors were saying. And it's a highly selective presentation by the prosecutors, because they have Mutreb confessing that, yes, he ordered Khashoggi to be killed. We have the assassins confessing that, yes, they met with Qahtani before the mission began, but Qahtani is never questioned. MBS is never questioned. The whole purpose of the trial was to find scapegoats in that Tiger team that could be blamed, so that Qahtani and MBS were absolved of all responsibility. And one other thing we discovered is, 5 people were convicted. They were originally sentenced to death in that trial. Then the sentence was commuted to 20 years. And what I'm told from 2 sources who have been longtime sources for U.S. intelligence is that these 5 convicts of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi are not in anything that you and I would consider a prison. They're not behind bars. It's a luxury compound. And one of them, a Dr. Tubegi, the Ministry of Interior doctor who injected Khashoggi with those lethal drugs from Cairo, was recently seen working out at the gym.
Justice Saudi style.
Yes, exactly.
All right.
Yeah, not anything that we would consider a real trial by Western standards.
Mike Isikoff, chief investigative correspondent for Yahoo News, with fascinating new details on this grisly murder in his latest podcast edition of Conspiracy Land. It's out this week and will run all month long. Mike Isikoff, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Great to talk to you.
Coming up next, this week's winners and losers in the media. See if you agree with the editors of Mediaite about what they say about the local Fox reporter who went rogue live on the air. You're watching Brian Ross Investigates on the Law&Crime Trial Network. Time now for this week's winners and losers in the media, as chosen by the editors of Mediaite. And we're joined by Aidan McLaughlin, who's the editor-in-chief of Mediaite, which, like the Law&Crime Trial Network, is part of the Dan Abrams media empire. And Aidan, you chose as your winner this week Jon Stewart for his appearance on the Steve Colbert Show.
The only coronavirus we have is in Wuhan. Yes. Where they have a lab called, what's the lab called again, Stephen?
The Wuhan Novel Coronavirus Lab.
I believe that's the case.
And
now,
how long have you worked for Senator Ron Johnson?
Let me tell you something. About Ron Johnson. This is not a conspiracy. Here's the thing about science.
You could be.
Very funny and right to the point, Aidan.
Really funny, and also a little bit controversial, which is why Jon Stewart is particularly a winner today, because this idea, this theory that the coronavirus could have leaked from a lab in Wuhan as opposed to having traveled from animals to humans through a wet market in Wuhan has been considered a conspiracy theory by most in the media for months since the pandemic began. It was, in fact, just a few months ago that if you tried to post on Facebook any sort of mention of the fact that the coronavirus could have leaked from a lab, you would have your post taken down by Facebook. So Jon Stewart going on Stephen Colbert and saying that this is not a conspiracy theory, this idea that it could have leaked from a lab. Listen, we don't know which is the correct theory, so we don't really have any idea. But you can't say that one is a conspiracy theory because it has not been debunked. And I think that was an important thing for Jon Stewart to say. And it's telling that Colbert sort of suggested that he was working for Ron Johnson in response, which shows that a considerable amount of people still consider this a conspiracy theory.
And this week's losers, the local Fox reporter in Houston who went rogue on the air live. Let's look at this.
Right, before we get to that story, I want to let you, the viewers, know that Fox Corp has been muzzling me to keep certain information from you, the viewers. And from what I'm gathering, I am not the only reporter being subjected to this. I am going to be releasing some recordings about what goes on behind the scenes at Fox because it applies to you, the viewers. I found a nonprofit journalism group called Project Veritas. It's going to help put that out tomorrow, so tune into them.
And that's a Fox-owned station, Aidan.
That's right. So that is Fox 26 reporter Ivory Hecker in Houston, who is calling out Fox Corp, the parent company that owns the network that she works for. And she has apparently signed on with Project Veritas, a conservative group that does these kind of things. They get people in media to turn on their employers and secretly record them. That reporter has now been suspended by Fox 26. It doesn't sound like it's going to be a great week for them if they're going to be releasing secretly recorded videos over the course of the next couple of days.
They will feel the pain of Veritas as many others have. Aidan, thank you so much for being with us here tonight. And thanks to all of you for joining us this evening on Brian Ross Investigates. Much more to come next week. And thanks to our great crew here at Law&Crime for getting us on the air and off the air every single week.